Over the course of the novel Yang Shen, Fletcher Thorson Wood travels hundreds of miles from Hong Kong to Ningbo and Shanghai, and then up the Yangtze River 260 miles to the river town of Wuhu. The maps in the book Yang Shen, which are based mostly on United Kingdom Hydrographic Office charts drawn by British naval officers in the 1850s, show Fletcher's route in detail from Ningbo to Wuhu. This video presentation will follow along on the same route, map by map, as they appear in Yang Shen, and relate some of the detail of Fletcher's journey. Although Fletcher and his brother boarded the clipper Essex in Hong Kong, our journey here will begin in the central China coastal town of Ningbo. The novel Yang Shen begins aboard the American clipper ship Essex in the islands of the Chushan archipelago, east and south of the entrance to the mighty Yangtze River in China, not far from the city of Shanghai. When first we are aboard Essex with Fletcher Thorson Wood, she has come north from Hong Kong to the port of Ningbo, and is on her way north to Gutzloff Island, where she expects to pick up a pilot to take her on into Shanghai. Essex departed Hong Kong only one day ahead of the fleet of English and French ships on its way to occupy the island of Chushan, as an opening salvo in the third year of war between the Western Allies and the Empire of China. Not long after the Allied fleet arrives off the town of Dinghai, where once again they are welcomed by natives eager for trade, just as in the previous year. Essex leaves Ningbo and sails down the Yung River past Junhai and Kintong Island, guided by her treacherous Chinese pilot toward a pirate ambush at the Volcano Islands. Essex was a full clipper with square-rigged sails and all three masts, a very large vessel to be attempting the shallow seas of the archipelago. She was very much like this 1863 illustration of the tea clipper Taiping, except that Essex had 5 yards on her foremast and mizzenmast. Fighting her way free of the pirate gang led by the renegade Englishman Foky Tom, Essex finds her way north from the volcanoes through the shoals and shallows of the archipelago, using sailing directions in a book called The Chinese Commercial Guide, which describes in painstaking detail the best routes between all the rocks and reefs threatening her course to Gutzloff Island, as well as the direction and speed of currents and ebb and flow of the tides. In the 1850s, the entrance to the Yangtze had been surveyed by the British and marked with aids to navigation. A light vessel anchored off the south entrance to the river could be seen in a telescope from Gutzloff. The course into the river was lined on the north of the passage by red buoys, and opposite them on the south by black buoys, all the way west to the Huangpu River outer bar. The outer bar was called the Wusong Bar, for the town of Wusong located there. Shanghai is not on the Yangtze River, but rather 12 miles south, on the Huangpu River, called the Huangpujiang by the Chinese. In 1860, there were 2 bars built up at the entrance of the Huangpu by deposits from the Yangtze. At low tide, larger clippers with deeper drafts could not cross the shallow water over the Wusong bars, and had to wait weeks sometimes for high water. Once over the bars, Essex negotiated the ship channel east of the middle ground and struggled upstream against wind, current, and tide to Shanghai. The native city was encircled by a 3-mile-long stone wall faced with gray brick 20 to 24 feet high and 15 feet thick. North of the city wall, the French and British settlements, called concessions, lay along the bank of the Huangpu River up to Suzhou Creek. Western trading firms, banks, and insurance companies lined the Bund, an old footpath along which Chinese hauled boats upriver. North of the creek, over the Suzhou Creek Bridge, then the Will's Toll Bridge, was the American settlement, and the Astor House Hotel, known in earlier years as Richard's Hotel. This view of the Astor House is one of many photos and drawings of old Shanghai that can be seen in the online repository at Virtual Shanghai. The hotel has stood at the confluence of river and creek for many years. Today it is known as the Pujiang Hotel. Offices of the Shanghai Custom House moved several times in the 1850s, and by 1860 had established its presence in an old temple on the Bund in order to be closer to the western ships in the harbor. The several tiled roofs over its entrance and the high temple roof behind made the custom house appear as strangely out of place as a junk moored among merchantmen. The native city was a walled enclave of temples and yamen, mandarin offices, crisscrossed by narrow waterways that entered the city through special gates in the wall, water gates. There were gates for roads at each of the 4 directions, and several more smaller gates, all mounted with wooden towers for defense. Around the outside of the wall, along its foot, there was a shallow moat, which communicated with the creeks that crossed through the city. Having reached Shanghai by clipper ship, Fletcher continued upriver as first mate aboard the Chinese war steamer Confucius. Confucius was a side-wheel paddle steamer of 468 tons capacity, built in New York and brought out to Shanghai through Hong Kong in 1853. Converted to a gunboat, she was sold to the Chinese to suppress pirates. A journey by steamer up the Yangtze from Shanghai always began with the 12-mile stretch out to Wusong. At Wusong, outbound vessels could purchase opium from the Westerners' hulks moored there. Away from the tax authorities at Shanghai, opium that could be used upriver or on the coast to trade for tea and silk. From Wusong, the gunboat Confucius steamed 162 nautical miles up the Yangtze to Zhenjiang, which in daylight might take a river steamer 3 days if the tides and currents were favorable. Nanking was another 39 miles from Zhenjiang, another half day. River pilots ascended the river often to keep up with the changes in shoals and shallows. The Longshan crossing was the first major obstacle for deep-draft western vessels on the lower reaches of the Yangtze River. The sailing directions in S. Wells Williams, the Chinese commercial guide, drew upon the experience of British ships and steamers in the 1850s to cite precise directions for the crossing, which required taking visual sightings on the Longshan Pagoda on the north shore to adjust a vessel's course over the crossing. Once safely past Longshan, Confucius went up to the river town of Jiangyin. Here, a shortcut north from the Grand Canal along Xicheng Creek emptied into the Jiangyin anchorage and reduced the trip east from the canal to Shanghai by 60 miles. Between Jiangyin and Yangzhung Island, the river deepened along rock ledges and allowed the steamer to speed forward with less hindrance from obstacles to navigation. Past Starling Island, the river made a convoluted turn around Yangzhung Island, and down and around to Zhenjiang. On his second outing on the river, Fletcher sails on Laolin's junk south from Yangzhung Island along a small river called the Jiuchu, in order to get to the town of Danyang and observe rebel movements. A half-day's steaming further upriver from Zhenjiang brought Confucius to the rebel capital of Nanking, called Tianjin by the Taiping. The wall around Nanking was said to have been 30 miles long. In the days of the Taiping, the rebels built several palaces for the Heavenly King and other lesser kings, after destroying all the old temples. Confucius is forced to stop at Nanking, and Fletcher, the captain, and old Wang are taken before rebel officers. These preserved remnants of the old Nanking city wall give some idea of the magnitude of effort needed to storm a walled city. At Nanking, the walls were 30 feet high, and there were walls within walls. In this picture, looking through the Zhonghua Gate, 4 walls are visible. The city gates were the most vulnerable places in the walls, and often attacked first. Western artillery shortened dramatically the time needed to breach walls like these. Released by the rebels, Confucius follows the river around Nanking and starts south on the reach to Wuhu to pick up her cargo of tea. At the pillars, she encounters large numbers of rebel troops crossing the river for Nanking. As the steamer starts back downriver with her tea, she comes upon a great battle at Nanking, where the rebels have gathered to break the imperial siege of the walled city and to disperse the imperial encampment, called the Jiangnan Daiying. Five rebel armies, 100,000 soldiers, attacked the imperial encampment from 4 directions. Completely outnumbered, the imperial troops who do not escape the encirclement are brutally slaughtered. Confucius is appalled by the spectacle. The pale horse of death, thought Fletcher, flies behind the red horse of war outside the walls of Nanking. Has any living man ever come closer to a vision of the apocalypse? Escaping from the Holocaust at Nanking, Confucius makes her way back downriver, past Zhenjiang to Jiangyin, and then to Wusong, and finally back to the comparative safety of Shanghai. Having seen the rebels themselves, Fletcher has now decided what he must do next, and that decision will bring him back out onto the Yangtze again, aboard Confucius.